One, I kind of wanted to give the Bucks a second All-Star, and if you take the minutes out of the equation and you kind of average them out, then it's pretty much the same for those two guys. Middleton might even be a little bit ahead. So with all that, I decided to give Middleton a slight edge.
See, it's hard to make a case against what you just said for both Lowry and Middleton. However, I have both of those guys as the two toughest omissions in the East. I think that the Bucks are head and shoulders above the rest of the East right now, record-wise. They likely will get a second All-Star, and it likely will be Middleton. But for the sake of argument, I'm giving my final two spots to a couple of first-timers. And call me a homer, which I know you all will, but I'm picking representatives from both of our favorite teams, Ben. I'm giving Zach LaVine, who is one of the top scorers in the league right now, the sixth spot. And I'm giving the seventh and final spot on the Eastern Conference bench to my guy, Spencer Dinwiddie. Now, Kyrie Irving, I think if he didn't get hurt, probably would have been voted in as a starter, which Dinwiddie would not have made the team. But just looking at the way Dinwiddie's played in Irving's absence, and I know he's tailing off a bit, but still averaging over 20 points a game. And with him being a G League cast-off, I think from him going from second-round pick to out of the league to all-star would just be a beautiful story. LaVine was a lottery pick, and it's good to see him lighting up the scoreboards, and it's great, so I think he'll get it. But the homer and the Nets fan in me wants to give that seventh and final spot to Dinwiddie. So my East reserves are Simmons, Butler, Beal, Adebayo, Tatum, LaVine, and Dinwiddie, with the toughest omissions being Lowry and Middleton. Again, I'm not trying to be right. I guess we'll leave these up to see how many we got, but this is who I feel should make up the reserves in the East.
Yeah, I mean, the last guy I had, this was probably the only one I was surprised you didn't have on your list. The rest of them, I can't argue with any of the guys you picked. I was very surprised you didn't have Domantas Sabonis, who I had as a virtual lock. First of all, I think the Pacers deserve to get one All-Star. They've been really good. They've been basically just as good as the Celtics have been this year. I mean, they're right there with them. And the guy who's really been just extraordinary for them, and I think casual fans maybe are sleeping on how good he is Domantas Sabonis, who there was a recent article in the Ringer that I should send to you, Jason, that talked about screen assists as a component of a guy's value, because often people kind of omit that as a part of the play. If a guy screens someone out of the way, it can often create essentially the same advantage as someone who's passing open a teammate. And Sabonis was the only guy who was in, I believe, the top metric when it came to both screen assists and actual assists. He's one of the better passers in the league for a big man. He is a dominant, embarrass you around the rim type finisher who will just jam on guys' heads. And the rest of this team has either suffered injuries or really kind of regressed a little bit. There's been no one there besides Brogdon who's really played at a even close to all-star level. And Sabonis to me has been just incredible. He's been a fulcrum for them offensively, and defensively he's been better this year. So I felt really like he deserves an all-star bid in my opinion this year.
So I'm going to tell you why I don't think Sabonis will be picked, even though it's a great case for him to be. If it was traditional East versus West, where the West always seems to have more all-star bigs, which we'll get into in a minute, because there's a draft and there's so many good bigs in the West, I think it's okay having only one true center from an Eastern Conference team in Joel Embiid. And I know Sabonis can flip-flop between the 5 and the 4 with Miles Turner there as well, but I think the NBA could get away with only having Embiid representing the East from the center position, because we'll get into these big men that we think will come out of the West, and I think that will hurt Sabonis' case, but we'll know in a couple of days.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be really interesting, and it's fun to watch the guy play. Obviously, famous father, and I'm happy for him. I mean, he was part of that, obviously, that trade that involved Oladipo and Paul George, and all of a sudden, man, that trade looks pretty good for the Pacers. At any rate, moving on to the West, Jason, why don't you talk over the guys that you felt like were locks?
So I think if these two played in bigger markets, I think they would be absolute locks, and that's Nikola Jokic and Damian Lillard. I think that Jokic and Lillard are pound for pound, two of the best players in the league playing in a small market. You have Jokic, who has the Nuggets at the top of the West. I think the Blazers are starting to go on a little bit of a run now that they're in their rhythm with Melo, McCollum. But Damian Lillard is probably the best pure point guard in the league. I know you can make an argument for Kemba, Steph when he's healthy, but just the way Dame takes over a game, I think you have to have those two as absolute locks. And another one who's finally, I think, going to get his due is the Frenchman, Rudy Gobert, who I think being on bad Jazz teams has hurt his candidacy in the past. But I think with the Jazz being as good as they are in a dominating Western Conference, I think that he cannot be overlooked this year. So I think that Jokic, Lillard, and Gobert are three locks for the West.
I'm so glad that you mentioned, and maybe my bolding our locks help, but I'm so glad you mentioned Rudy Gobert because this is a guy to me who has just really gone underappreciated in the league. I mean, right now he's averaging 14 and a half rebounds a game, Jason. I mean, he's the best defensive player in the league at this point. And that statistic I mentioned about screen assists, you know who's right there at the top, Jason? It's Rudy Gobert. He's one of these guys who just his offensive contributions are so overlooked because he's so big that he can just screen guys out of the way, and it makes life so much easier. I do sometimes wonder on this Jazz team, as good as Donovan Mitchell is, who I want to get to in a second, how much he benefits from having Rudy Gobert as both one of the best rollers in the league, a guy who can pretty much finish anything given his height, and also one of the best screeners, and how much that benefits him. But to me, the question I had was, when I looked at this Jazz team, I feel like a lot of people think that Donovan Mitchell is the best player on the Jazz, and I feel like that guy is actually Rudy Gobert. I mean, what do you make of Donovan Mitchell and his candidacy for this year?
I think he's going to be another lock. You know, I was just typing this out in the notes. You're going to have three first-time All-Stars already in Luka Doncic, Trae Young, and Pascal Siakam, who are all voted in the starters by the fans, the players, and the coaches. And I think that, you know, you have Adebayo, Tatum. You can have as many as 7 or 8 first-time All-Stars, and I think Donovan Mitchell makes the cut. I mean, with the way Mike Conley has struggled and with Bogdanovich playing really well, Mitchell is elevated into that star role where in a 7-game series, you have Bogdanovich there as a sharpshooter, but it's going to be Mitchell taking all of the tough shots and, you know, eventually trying to be one of the next superstars in the league. So I think because of how well Utah is doing, I think Mitchell is another virtual lock for this team. I really do. So
I agree. I think it's going to be really hard to not get him on the team, and I'll give it to you. I mean, I think he's probably a lock. I just don't know. I mean, unlike the East has all these wings who are just incredible that it's really hard to piece who's better than who. I mean, we had this with Beal and Young, and you know, I think Levine's in that territory of just these really good offensive guys who defensively, you know, maybe aren't so good. And then you have guys like Lowry who are kind of all around, and the same thing with a guy like Butler. In the West, there is kind of this tiered out system to me, and the other guy to me that kind of belongs in that same tier who just, you know, I never in a million years thought I'd say it, but I had to find myself giving the nod to Brandon Ingram to get a spot on this team. I mean, how did you feel about Ingram, and did he end up making the cut for you?
yeah, I think this is the last one we agree on, which is good that we don't have identical rosters because then what's the point of doing this podcast? But I think because of the whole hype surrounding Zion and just the way he's elevated his game while waiting for Zion to come back, and you can make a smaller case for Lonzo Ball, but just Ingram with a pair of 40-point games is just taking on the role of team leader after he was cast aside by the Lakers to get Anthony Davis in there to play with LeBron. I think that Ingram has really opened the eyes of a lot of opposing coaches and general managers. And, you know, I think he's going to stay in New Orleans, but this man is earning himself quite the second contract, which I think he'll get this summer as a restricted free agent, So I think just based on pure talent, I think you're going to have another first-time All-Star as, you know, as they get announced on Thursday. I think that, you know, Ingram will be on that list.
So I want to save one of these because I think it's a really fascinating question, and I want to save it because we kind of know who each of us picked. I want you to talk to me, Jason, because there was one guy that you picked that I was close on, but I just couldn't quite get there. And that's Karl Anthony Towns, which is a guy I did ultimately omit from my team. He was my toughest cut, and I just want to hear your reason why you ended up choosing Towns. I mean, I think probably some people have kind of an idea, but what made you decide that Towns was worthy of the All-Star bid this year?
Well, as I said, earlier about how big men in the West have just dominated in past years with Boogie Cousins and Anthony Davis. And, there are already a couple of pure centers here in this pool of draft candidates with AD, Joel Embiid. And I just think with the numbers that Towns has in his fifth year, 27 points a game, 10 and a half, almost 11 rebounds, 4 assists. His PER is almost a 28. And as bad as the Timberwolves are, I just think he's one of those stat stuffing all stars on a bad team, like we've seen for years with the Jermaine O'Neals and DeMarcus Cousins in Sacramento and Anthony Davis when the Pelicans were bad. I mean, I just think he makes it based on the numbers he's putting up, and that gives you a nice pool of centers here to pick from if you're the captains. LeBron, I think Luke is actually the captain, but and Giannis in the East, where you have Davis, Embiid, Gobert, Jokic, Towns. You can kind of split up the size to where it's not these four behemoths going up against just Embiid in the East. I think it'll make the game a lot more interesting with Towns in there.
Yeah, I mean, so I had kind of a debate, a couple debates for my last couple spots, and I had the debate of would I choose Towns or Devin Booker, and I ended up going with Devin Booker for a few reasons. One was that I just felt like his contribution to his team winning games. I mean, when you look at the surrounding talent, it's really hard to argue that Booker Booker had a better team than Towns did. And yet they're ahead of the Timberwolves in the standings. And then on top of that, Booker has been healthy where Towns ended up missing a few games here. Booker's played 13 more games than Towns has. And his team's been better in spite of the fact that they lost debatably their second best player in DeAndre Ayton. And Booker, to me, has made the rest of his teammates just a little bit better. So I don't think he has the stats, but I really felt like the way that he led that Phoenix team was a little bit of a breakthrough in his career. And I think it really bodes well for the Suns team, who's probably missing a piece still. I think they still need one more guy there. But they've got the makings of something. You watch this team and there's some direction, and a lot of it comes from the fact that Booker is just that good, and defensively, he really has played like a different guy this year, and that's something I've been very impressed by. So he ended up making the cut for me, and I'd kind of call that my last pick because the one before it is the one that I wanted to save, Jason, because I think this is the most fascinating All-Star debate I can remember. And that's for one of the point guard spots. So, Jason, do you want to say who your kind of your last point guard spot went to?
Yeah, absolutely. Just real quick though on Devin Booker. I mean, he's just a result of numbers because in another lifetime or generation, I mean, he would have been a multiple time All Star already with the numbers he puts up, but he plays on a bad team and he's just left off in a numbers crunch. I mean, even in a year where there's no Golden State Warriors, right? There's no Steph, there's no Clay, there's no Draymond. Even D'Angelo Russell was an All Star last year with Brooklyn. It's still difficult to pick 7 reserves. I mean, the starters, the NBA nailed it. We're thrilled with the 10 guys that were voted in as starters, and I think the draft will be really fun. But, dude, I mean, it's just a numbers crunch. So I'm giving my final spot to Russell Westbrook. And the reason why I'm picking Westbrook over Booker is because the Rockets are there. I know they've slipped a bit in the standings, but, Russell Westbrook is the all-star game. And him, much like Kobe Bryant, is one of those few players that goes hard in these All-Star games, takes everything seriously. And I think the way him and James Harden look, I mean, those two guys are built for February, for the All-Star game. They're not built for June. I don't think they're going to win a title. But Russell Westbrook, to me, just lives and breathes All-Star. And that's why I think that he'll get it. I mean, these are just predictions. So who's your seventh and final spot?
So this is the thing. I kind of had this moment of I was gonna pick, two more guys. I looked at Booker and I said he's kind of the best of the bunch. And then I got down and I found myself looking at 3 players, Jason. One was Towns, who when I looked at how many games he'd missed And the fact that his team just hadn't been very good, I said, you know what? I think I'm gonna kind of pass. And then I ended up with two players, Jason, and I